Where can you find the available means of persuasion? Well, in their respective topoi, of course. I'm gonna guess that the answer is no, but have you ever been in a class where no matter what you tried, you just couldn't grasp a concept? I can remember a couple of times that's happened for me, like once when I was trying to understand how to use polar coordinates and decided to study English instead. But I also ran into that experience in my first rhetoric class. We were talking about Aristotle's rhetoric and the concept of topics, which I really struggled to understand, and I think a lot of people in the class face that same struggle as well. See, Aristotle calls topics sources from which arguments should be derived, and that sounds pretty straightforward, but it still feels like a pretty tricky concept sometimes. So I thought we could continue our leisurely discussion of Aristotle's rhetoric by focusing on the topics, or topoi if you want to use the Greek, mostly because it's an important concept and a large percentage of the book is made up of lists of topics. So if we don't understand the concept of the topic, we're going to struggle with a lot of the text. And of course, we don't want that, so let's start putting our topographical map all together. Now, if you're like me or anyone who uses English in the way that people who use English these days use it, you'll already have a definition for the word topic, and it's not going to serve you very well in the context of classical rhetoric. I imagine if somebody asked you what the topic of your paper was, you'd respond by telling them what it was about: polar bears or jazz or wild cilantro. That's what they would expect when they asked you about your topic. But that's not what Aristotle was talking about. Instead, Aristotle's topics and the concept of rhetorical topics in general refer to something very different. The topic is not the subject of your paper. It's a tool you use to develop the argument for your paper. And if you remember, Aristotle called rhetoric a way to discover the available means of persuasion in any given situation. So if your goal is to find those available means of persuasion, the topics are the means that you discover. So a topic in this context isn't the subject of your argument, it's a tool that you're using to find or develop your central argument. In fact, the word topic, or Greek topos, means place, and as Aristotle translator George A. Kennedy puts it, it refers metaphorically to that location or space in an art, more literally perhaps the place in a handbook, where a speaker can look for available means of persuasion. Kennedy also points out that Aristotle did not coin the term. In fact, he doesn't even provide a careful definition of the term, which suggests that it was already in common usage and he could trust that his audience already knew what he was talking about. Which is great for his audience, but it's a problem for those of us who have to figure out what to do with these topics some 2,000 years later. And all of this is to say that if you're having trouble grasping the concept of topics, don't feel bad. In a lot of ways, the deck is kind of stacked against you. But now that we know what topics aren't, we can start talking about what they do and what they are. While Aristotle may not spend much time defining the concept of topics, he does spend a lot of time listing them. So we can start by looking at the things that Aristotle calls topics, and then work backwards to try to figure out what they have in common. So in Book 1 of the Rhetoric, Aristotle lists various topics that are associated with specific genres of rhetoric, which we've discussed before. For example, when it comes to deliberative rhetoric, which usually involves informing a legislative assembly's decisions, Aristotle lists several potential topics. He writes, for example, thus one who is going to give advice on finances should know what and how extensive are the revenues of the city, so that if any have been left out, they be added, and if any are rather small, they may be increased. Or, on war and peace, it is necessary to know the power of the city, both how great it is already and how great it is capable of becoming. And in regard to food, it is necessary to know what expenditure is adequate for the city and what kinds are on hand and what can be imported. So we can begin to see how these topics help us to find the available means of persuasion. If you're going to make an argument about the finances of a city, it's important to know a thing or two about the current state of that city's finances. Otherwise, you're just not going to be able to say anything very useful. Similarly, you aren't going to make a very persuasive argument about going to war if you vastly overestimated your own city's strength. But there are topics for other specific genres too. For example, speaking of epideictic rhetoric, Aristotle says, since praise is based on actions and to act in accordance with deliberate purpose is characteristic of a worthy person, one should try to show him acting in accordance with deliberate purpose. That is, if you want to make a good argument about how good someone is, you should show how they deliberately do praiseworthy things. And with respect to judicial rhetoric, Aristotle also outlines several topics. For example, wrongdoers are likely to be unsuspected if their appearance and condition in life is inconsistent with the charges. For example, a weak man is not likely to be suspected on a charge of assault. Which is to say that it's an easier argument to defend a weak man against a charge of assault than a strong one. Not because a weak person can't commit assault, but because it's much less likely. And as I know you remember from our previous discussion of ancient Greek judicial rhetoric, rhetoric doesn't deal in absolutes, it works with probabilities. So at first glance, the topics might just look like rules about the world or facts that are reliably true. And on some level, that is what they are. But they can also function as outlines for our arguments. They are, in other words, the forms that persuasive arguments can take. If you know, for example, that you need to make a persuasive argument that somebody has in fact committed a crime, you can go to the topics and realize that you'll have more success if you can find a way to make the accused look like the kind of person who would commit that crime. In that sense, then, the topics kind of look like instructions for persuasive argumentation. They show you the kinds of arguments that are available and that you can use as a starting point for an argument of your own. And rhetoric, then, is the tool for discovering those topics, or helping you to account for all of the possible arguments and then finding the one that would be the most effective in your situation. And I think that gets clearer when we start to look at the general topics that Aristotle describes near the end of Book 2 of the Rhetoric. There, he talks about general topics that work in any kind of situation or any genre of rhetoric. These general topics look like instructions for making arguments based on specific rules or principles, like making arguments from opposites, for example, showing that self-control is a good thing by showing that a lack of self-control is a bad thing. They also include topics that are based in things like time, like persuading somebody that they should give you a reward for something you did because they would have been willing to promise you a reward before you did it, and other things like comparisons, cause and effect relationships, and contradictions. The general topics are more clearly generic templates of reasoning that you can use to develop an effective argument. So, for example, if you want to persuade your audience to do something, you can just look for the topic that suits your purpose and put it to work. So Aristotle called rhetoric a tool for finding out what would be persuasive, and then he goes on to make lists and lists of things that are persuasive. It's a good demonstration of what he says rhetoric should do. But I wouldn't say that you need to sit down with the rhetoric and memorize all of the topics in order to become more persuasive yourself. You can think of the topics as a set of prefabricated arguments, or you could think of them as a source for rhetorical inspiration. However, as I've been working on today's show, I've come to think of topics in a slightly different way. Obviously, Aristotle's list is not comprehensive. It doesn't list every possible argument that a person could make, and I don't think we should consider his list prescriptive either. These topics are not a list of ways that you should be making an argument. Instead, I think the topics are better understood as the channels through which arguments typically flow. It's like how water can flow wherever it wants to on a flat surface, but then it gradually carves out a channel and then a canyon for itself. So the more people make a particular argument, the deeper the channel will be and the more common that rhetorical strategy will get. I mean, why go far out of the box if there's already a strategy that has been shown to work time and time again? Like with the topic we discussed earlier, it is probably less likely that a small and weak person could commit assault, but it's not impossible. You can still make the case that a small violent person is to blame for the crime. However, the water of reasoning flows so readily in the direction of matching the perpetrator's appearance to the crime that you may not find that to be the most effective strategy. So you may find another topic and choose to define assault in terms that go beyond a difference in physical strength. Because remember, this isn't really about what's objectively true or possible. It's about predicting where your audience's thoughts and feelings are likely to go. So the topics aren't useful because they give you a guaranteed list of things to do. They're useful because they're descriptions of patterns that people use to make judgments. And of course, you don't need a formalized list of all possible arguments to do that. Instead, you can just be a thoughtful observer of your audience and listen to them carefully. Because the more you know about how your audience thinks, the better equipped you'll be to adjust your argument to meet their expectations. Aristotle understood rhetoric as a tool for persuading large audiences that are made up of everyday people rather than experts. Experts might quibble for days or months about whether something is true or even what the definition of true is. But real-life people are generally more concerned about living their lives. As such, rhetoric isn't a tool for establishing objective reality. It's a tool for working within everyday subjective realities, helping people to recognize truths and then do something about them. So the topics may be difficult to grasp initially, but they can actually have an immense practical value. And I'll conclude by saying that I don't think any individual topic by itself or any list of topics is all that useful. Instead, the value that the topics provide is that they show us that our audiences will rely on established patterns of reasoning and thought to form their judgments. So, whether you have a formalized list of topics or not, what you really need to do is identify the strategies that are available to you and then adapt them to fit your audience's patterns. So be on the lookout for common patterns of reasoning and argumentation. Be alert to your audience and the ways that they tend to think, and then present your argument in a way that will make persuasive sense to them. In a nutshell, that's the process of finding the available means of persuasion, and that's what Aristotle's rhetoric is all about, which makes this a pretty good stopping point for today. Of course, we've got more good stuff coming your way, so don't go too far, but enjoy your week, and I'll see you in the next one.